So much. Thank you so much for joining us today with Professor Tootle. This is going to be a fascinating conversation because it's an idea that I thought of when we first started outlining almost a full year's worth of topics that Professor Tootle, immediately jumped on and said, we must do that. It's mostly a serious topic about public policy and philosophy and history, about the meaning of words and whether it's important. But we should have some time to have some fun with it too. So let me start by having a little fun. At the end of last week's conversation, I believe it was, Professor Tootle and I were just talking, and we were wondering whether we should name our series, and he threw out Toots, McGroots, Brick and Brack. And I changed that. I looked up all those words. Toots, of course, with his name, Professor Tootle. He said McGroots, but I didn't know what that meant. So I did looked up cahoots, which isn't necessarily a great word because we're not doing this in secret. This is obviously public. But both Brick and Brack have interesting connotations, including Brack with my last name. So at some point, we might name this Toots, Cahoots, Brick and Brack, or something similar. But for first, we should find out whether words have meaning and whether it's important. So a brief one line on me. It would seem like a guy with a political science degree and a law degree, a profession of words, would really take this seriously. And I do. But boy, do I screw up on this all the time. And people that see my Facebook posts, you'll just go, oh my gosh, I wonder if John means what he's saying or says what he means. And my intent is that I do, but I'm not saying I'm brilliant at this. There is a chance Professor Tootle, though, is brilliant at this, because wait till you hear the topics. But before we get to that, Professor Tootle, why don't we give a little bit of your background?
I almost all history, bachelor's and master's and PhD, all in history. But the subject of my dissertation was on the public perception of the presidency and how it was shaped by elite political journalists. And so I've been always interested in this topic of the gap between perception and reality, and then the evolution of what we know about modern psychology and shaping arguments is a big part of what creates the perception. And one of the earliest drivers of why I kept being interested in history was I would see that the public perception of an event was so different from the historical perception of the event. Or there would be times, and we're going to discuss some of them today, where the contemporaries understood it, then people who came later lied about it, and then historians later figured out that they were right, these people were wrong, and now but we're still teaching it the wrong way. And in all of these cases, then the sort of damage comes in the modern era, or when we're trying to make public policy or decisions really about how to live our lives, and we're left with this these legacies of old political fights that really we have no feeling about one way or another, but we're left with this language that they use that shapes how we think. And I'm and it could be something that a legacy of racism or even some old national security fight, and it shapes how we see each other. And when we talk, one of our long-term goals has been to get past labels and have more productive conversations. And one of the things that keeps that from happening is the language that we use, that and so often is oppositional, and the labels we put on ourselves. So anyway, that was my original reason why I jumped on it, because it seemed so appropriate for what we were talking about.
Excellent. Well, team, we're going to have a brief discussion. Professor Tootle is going to talk most. And for the recording, it will probably just be him, focused on him, FYI. When we do a Q&A from you all, we might open it up to a big picture again for the recording, so just FYI. So we've got 6 main topics, I think, but it could be varied a little bit. We're going to take us through confirmation bias and what that means. Then we're going to go to the freedom, particularly North versus South, then some European words, left, right, capitalism, socialism, then Civil War, rebellion, secession, the rise of expertise, modernity, is it modernity?
Modernity, yeah.
Trying to teach me new words, totalitarianism and ideas as solutions, finding a little bit on ignorance, where Professor Tootle will make fun of me because that's people who use words and they not quite sure what they mean. And then we're going to open up to your Q&A. And so feel free to get your questions going, and we'll get to those in about 25-ish minutes. Does it sound like a good game plan? Professor Tootle, start us out with what confirmation bias means.
Well, confirmation bias is how we frame arguments given what we shoots the brick with Brack. Sorry, I'm reading the comments. It's good stuff.
Yeah, it's not a good one, Darren. Yeah. Stop it.
Sorry. So, no, confirmation bias it is the bias we have based on how we frame an argument. And so, and one of the things that really was in the last 30 years of psychology, I'm not a psychologist, this is outside my area of expertise, but it's become such a well-studied area of psychology over the last 30 years, is the role that confirmation bias plays in how we shape arguments. And one of the things that is really astounding is that we want to be right about ourselves so badly that we will often engage in self-destructive behavior. And that means that you want to be right about yourself so much that that is a more powerful instinct that you have than self-preservation or wanting to remain alive. And you can, and if you take a step back and think about this in your own life, you can see where this is, where this plays out. For instance, you will create an identity about yourself and say, I'm a smoker. That's who I am. And you will continue to be a smoker because it's these things that are self-destructive become a part of your identity. And you say, this is just who I am. And so the danger is that now we understand this about psychology, and now also in public policy, in the public policy realm, we have the rise of what we call identity politics, where we want our politics to match our identity. And therefore, anybody who disagrees with us, we interpret that as an attack on who we are as people. I'll give you another smaller example of this from teaching, because I think at least some of you were teachers before, but there are a lot of different areas of social psychology that were studying different aspects of this over the years. But some of the first research that I paid attention to was in adult learners, because adult learners who come back to college, when they would go into a history class, particularly if it was a history class where they had lived through that event, they had already incorporated those events into their identity. And then when a history teacher came along to teach them something different, they would interpret that as an attack on themselves. And it was emotionally more difficult for adult learners to learn something that was contrary to what they had already put into themselves. I'll give you another far-flung example, but one of the more interesting studies that I think one of our AEI colleagues did looked into housing policy during the Clinton administration. And if you care about lifting people out of poverty, this was a very interesting study, because this looked at this program, very short-lived housing program of the Clinton administration, where they were putting impoverished families into homes, into neighborhoods. And later on, they found out something very interesting, which is that if you put a poor family or a quote unquote broken family into a neighborhood where the majority of households were had two-parent households within 1 square mile, if you put that family into that neighborhood, that you could virtually eliminate poverty the younger the children were. So to put this another way, if you take a neighborhood with a bunch of two-parent families and you put one poor family right in the middle of them, and in that family you have some children under the age of 6, those children will not grow up to be poor. And you say to yourself, why is that? And it's because you will fight with everything that is in you to recreate whatever you think of as being normal. You will recreate whatever pattern gets put into you when you're young. Whatever you think normal is, that's what you will strive to attain throughout the rest of your life. So whatever you think of as being normal, you will fight with all that is in you to achieve that level. That's why so often we see, children following in the steps of parents, because it's their parents that have established this is what normal is. And
So,
yeah, go ahead.
so Professor, let's go into your second big topic on that. And I'm looking at our friends with us today, and at least three of us have served in the Army. I assume that confirmation bias of thinking the enemy is just deadly evil and you can kill them because you're trained to think of them as not as human is an element of confirmation bias, whether it's true or not. But your next topic is a broader talking about freedom and how people might view freedom differently and have that expectation. And I think your example is the North versus South. Is that
Right.
correct? Take
Yes.
us through that.
But before we get to that, there's something interesting about the military, is because those of you who are veterans, it's one of the last few character shaping institutions left in society. So it is one of the few places where you go into it knowing I'm going to have my character reshaped. Anyway, maybe we should address that for a later topic, because it's interesting that we still have that as an institution. But getting back to at the time of our founding was only made possible because North and South used the same word but meant different things by it. So if you didn't have the North and the South both using the language of freedom, the United States would have never been founded. But the culture of North and South were so vastly different in how they developed their concepts of freedom that it's the thing that ultimately led to the Civil War. Because if you were somebody who settled in one of the northern colonies, and we look at Massachusetts and Virginia because those were the two hotbeds of the American Revolution. But in Massachusetts, the definition of freedom was so deep and so intimate, and it was personal, and it was based on religion. That you must have freedom of consciousness. You must be able to shape your local life and your community in order to have religious freedom. And in the South, their notion of freedom developed out of the institutions of slavery. I mean, it was slavery that allowed for political equality of non-slaves in the Virginia colony. So yes, Virginia is using the word freedom, but they mean freedom as propped up by slavery. And in the North, they mean freedom as freedom. I must be free in order to practice my religion. But when they get together, they're using the same word, but they mean something very different by it, because one of them is literally based on the idea that we can't have political equality for poor people and rich people, because the equality in Virginia was much more egalitarian in that sense, because it included rich people and poor people. But they wouldn't have allowed for political equality between rich and poor in Virginia if it weren't for slavery. So again, I'd say go back to the old classic book by Edmund Morgan, American Slavery, American Freedom, which is about the development of the idea of freedom in Virginia. If you want the full description of how that happened exactly. But the short version of the story is that slavery solved a political and a social problem for Virginia, which was what do you do with poor whites who were making trouble in the colony? And the answer is, we don't want any more of them because they're troublemakers. So we're going to bring in a labor force that we can keep oppressed. So and then once we have fewer of them, we can grant them political equality so that we can stay rich and stay in charge. And we're not going to bring in more people who are going to challenge us. Again, I'm shortening it, but if you want to talk about a problem of America over the long term, how about this problem that some people in this country and were willing to fight and die over a definition of freedom that depended upon slavery in order to function? That's going to be a little bit of a problem. So then the political impetus, because the revolution was failing and we needed to have a constitution, there was an even greater emphasis on not clarifying these issues in order to get the Constitution ratified. Because if we had really pointed out this distinction again, we probably wouldn't have been able, well, I know we wouldn't have been able to get the Constitution ratified. So we wouldn't have been able to fight the revolution if we had clarified these issues between North and South. And we wouldn't have been able to get the Constitution ratified. And what we see in the ratification debates of the Constitution is that, yes, we were using the same language to describe the Constitution, but then when those delegates went back to their states, they would describe that same Constitution very differently. And
intentionally. They knew what they were doing.
Well, I don't know how intentional it was. That's a good question. I just don't know. I'd have to go on a sort of person by person basis, and I'm just
okay. We'll leave that for another time.
Yeah.
It does dovetail nicely with the left and the right, and capitalism and socialism, both historically and currently. So talk to us about those.
So during the next era, what happens is there's stuff going on in Europe. The French Revolution is happening, and these notions of monarchy and restoration, with the government going back and forth in France, and also revolutions taking place in Latin America, and of course in the United States, we are seeing ourselves as kind of the people who did it first. And so anyone who kind of seems like they're doing what we were doing, we're all for it. But one of the problems is that in Europe, the terms left and right come into common usage. And the left had ideas that were in opposition to the American form of politics. And so does the right. And so those terms originally had a very distinct meaning in Europe, and but they weren't in common usage in the United States, because we knew enough at the time to know that the left and the right were not appropriate terms to use in American history. Usually the distinction that Americans would have been concerned with, and American politicians and people who were thinking about American politics, they were more concerned with teaching the American people that we were a pluralistic society and making sure that they understood the difference between what we would now call positive and negative liberty. So it's hard enough to teach people this. You know, if you took somebody who's a liberal and a conservative, a traditional liberal and a traditional conservative, that means that we hold all the same beliefs, because we all say we believe in the Declaration and we believe in the Constitution. So anybody who believes in our Declaration and our Constitution is an American. But there's more than one idea. There's more than one idea in our Constitution. There's more that you don't have just one right. So in other words, our system says, well, we need to protect the rights of the minority. And you say, oh, yes, that's a very important principle. But we also in our system say we have to protect the will of the majority through representative government. Ah, yes, that's a very important principle. Yes, and these two principles are in opposition to one another. So what we have to teach people and what we have to learn as Americans with every generation is that under a pluralistic system, we hold ideas that we consider good, that are in contradiction to one another. And if any one of them goes too far, they become bad. So the only reason all of these ideas are good ideas is because we hold them simultaneously. And the purpose of politics is to negotiate between these ideas that we all hold. And we're going to negotiate between these ideas, and we're going to be dedicated to doing it peacefully. So the left, is a repudiation of the American system of government, because it said on the left, you say that you don't have any individual rights, that all of your rights are social, and all of your rights are only of a social nature and are tied to your role in society. And our system of government says, no, that's not true. You have individual rights. And we negotiate, but on the right, they were monarchists aiming for a restoration of a king. And so in that traditional sense, if you're an American, you're neither of these things. You're supposed to reject the idea that you don't have individual rights, and you're also supposed to reject the idea that you have a king and the will of that king is going to be supreme, or that he's God ordained. So in other words, these are European ideas that at the time that they were talking about them in Europe, in the early to middle 1800s, nobody was using them in the United States or in an American context. There were Americans who began experimenting with socialism and European socialism and what was called utopian socialism. But Americans, one of the fun things about Americans, and we see this sometimes as a bad thing, but it's also kind of a good thing, is that if you give a bunch of American students a copy of the Communist Manifesto, they'll read it and say, well, I like the part about free textbooks. And you say, well, there's more in there than giving away textbooks. And then you give them a copy of, you start teaching them about Hitler, and they're like, yeah, but the Autobahn was a good idea. And you're like, there's this American tendency to pick out the part we like and just ignore the rest of it, especially when the author is serious about the whole thing. And so we have this American thing where they're like, I'm a little bit of a socialist. And you say, really? Do you really? And then you scratch the surface and you realize that person's not a socialist. Or this person says, Hitler had some good ideas. And you're like, what? That's a silly and absurd thing to say. And you're like, yeah, but did you see the Autobahn? And you're like, oh, that wasn't his significant idea. There is a tendency of Americans to look at ideas, especially foreign ideas, pick out the parts that they like and just ignore the parts that they don't like. But what this also leads to is, if you hear someone talking and nowadays and they say, I'm a socialist, I still in my head hear socialism is the single most deadly idea in all of human history. Socialism killed 100 million people in the 20th century. So if you're talking about bad ideas, and if your definition of bad ideas is which idea murdered the most human beings, socialism is number one on that list. But most people, when they use it, they just think it means sharing. Well, I don't think sharing is a bad idea. I think murdering people in order to create heaven on earth is a bad idea. And so understanding that people use these words, right and left, liberalism, conservatism, socialism, right? And they don't mean them with the same precision of people at the time.
Gotcha. And boy, there's a lot of information here. So
Right.
how to get through 3 more topics in the next 5 or 6 minutes.
Okay.
So Civil War, briefly on rebellion and succession.
Oh, so that's a perfect example, and that's why I always include it, is that when the Civil War was going on, nobody used the term Civil War. In the public and in newspapers in the North and in Congress, everybody referred to it as the rebellion. And we don't even see the use of the term the Civil War until the 1870s and 80s and 90s in newspapers, but not in Congress. And the reason is in an attempt to sort of bridge the gap, because Southerners really hated the use of rebellion. And so they're like, well, how about if we use the term Civil War? Well, you object to that? And so even using the term Civil War was a concession to try to get along with Southerners. But the people who were around at the time, and that's why we see the term rebellion stick around in Congress for so much longer, they understood that there was a really important principle that had to be remembered in using the term rebellion. And it's something that I don't even think people think about at all. But according to the United States government, I always pull down a map in class and I show, and I say, okay, class, where was the United States and where was the Confederacy? And they'll say, oh, the green part, that's the United States. And then this part in pink there, that's the Confederacy. And I'll say, and I'll remind them, well, according to the United States, there was no Confederacy. And Abraham Lincoln, in all of his language, was very clear that he always used the term the pretended Confederacy, the so-called Confederacy, in order to emphasize that there was never a legal entity called the Confederacy that was recognized by the United States government or by any foreign country. Some foreign countries extended belligerent rights to them, but by any legal definition, there was never anything called the Confederacy. And as far as how we treated the rebellion in the years during and after the war, we didn't treat them as a conquered country. We treated them as a bunch of individuals who had committed the individual crime of rebelling against the United States. And that's why they didn't have to, and so according to the United States, they never left. There was no secession according to the United States government. There was an attempted secession that was unsuccessful.
Fascinating.
Yeah, and so these other terms, this is another thing, when you start hearing people use the term war of northern aggression or war between the states, that's all very modern. That's 1920s, that's post Woodrow Wilson, that's the Klan, and that is all a recent neo-Confederate lie. But these terms all mean a lot to us. So anyway, I use that as an example of how language will frame an argument for us now in the 21st century, when at the time, everyone understood perfectly well what this meant, because their politicians were telling them all the time. Abraham Lincoln, in every speech that he used, was using this language with that precision.
So bringing us right up to current times with the rise of expertise and modernity. Talk to us.
Well, I guess what is now the current thing that is worrisome is that during the last 100 years or so, the rise of the social sciences have led to this use of language in order to essentially bully people into positions. They will invent a new word and then invent an ideology around it. And once they come up with it, some people will be in the in group and some people will be in the out group. And I guess the most recent, as in terms of 5 minutes ago kind of analysis, would say that everything that goes under the heading of woke is probably a concept that was invented in order to exclude people and figure out who to cancel, who to include in the group, and who to exclude from the group. So the reason this stuff works, getting back to what we first talked about, is because people will apply these labels to themselves and they will become a part of your identity. And then you will begin seeing people who disagree with you. You won't bother to ask the second, third, or fourth question and find out that this person actually agrees with you. And you will simply reject them because of the label that you have put upon yourself and the label that you put on others. One of the things, just to really wrap this up with something controversial, is one of the things that's most fascinating for me to study is when you get into really in-depth questionnaires about the issue of abortion, which seems to be on the surface something that really divides Americans. They put labels on themselves. But once you start asking Americans what they actually would like to be done, what you find is that about somewhere between 80 and 90% of Americans have about the same position on abortion. So you would think this would be one of these issues that would just be a slam dunk for politicians if they could just enunciate this formula that 80 to 90% of Americans all share when it comes to this seemingly divisive issue. And yet, because at some point you must put a label on yourself of being pro-life or pro-choice, that means that 40 to 50% of Americans are going to reject your position based simply on what you call it, rather than what it actually means in practice. So if that isn't controversial enough as a way to get into the Q&A.
And we're going to do a whole series just on abortion.
Okay.
So if you're interested in that topic, we'll get to that in coming months. But do touch on ignorance, because I like the Twain's quote, we're all ignorant only on different subjects.
Right.
And so people use that and I'm not sure they know they're ignorant though. So talk to us about that for a little bit and then we'll go to Q&A.
Well, especially if you grow up in the sort of modern era, let's say in the last 30 years, or you have kids who went to school in the last 20 or 30 years, they often go through the entire school system without really ever understanding American history and understanding the American system of government. And so they come to believe that politics is supposed to be a reflection of their own feelings. And this makes them even more susceptible to confirmation bias, because you don't have that sense in the back of your head, that sort of tingling that says, hold on, I should be slightly more skeptical of what I'm hearing, even if it matches with my own feelings. And so ignorance, there is a social and political cost to being ignorant. It does make you more, especially on these issues, it does make you more susceptible to simply agreeing with people because they share your feelings, because of your anger, or sharing your anger on a specific issue. And that's the kind of thing that doesn't bring you together. It tends to separate you. Tends to make you think that people who disagree with you are your enemies.
Okay, so thank you, Professor. I can't believe we have these huge highways of information to think about and ponder. So I'm going to be fascinated what kind of questions we have from our friends that decided to join us today. I'd prefer that you ask it in your own voice rather than typing it, but if for some reason you're shy or you're hoarse or can't speak today, feel free to type it and I'll try to catch up to it. But Darren or Major Overstreet.
Yeah, Darren's fine. So we see a lot of what you were just talking about, using words to influence the uneducated or whatnot. Have you seen best practices for holding people accountable for the words that they use?
Well, that's funny because I am interested as a teacher. And one of the things that's been frustrating for me is that even though the question of like what makes a good teacher has been studied for 70 years, so far there's really only one factor that is predictive of when you're trying to hire a good teacher. And I don't know if you could guess it, but it's enthusiasm for subject matter. There's never been any other factor in hiring of a teacher that is predictive of student learning over the long term. So in terms of best practice, I would just simply say we only know of one. If you want to hire a good history teacher, find someone who loves history. If you want to find a good math teacher, find someone who loves math. And really nothing else has proven to matter.
Well, but we seem in politics to reward untruths, though, to Darren's question. So
and media, certain media outlets,
media as well. The extreme, enticing way to present information instead of a factual way to present it.
Yes.
How are we going to untangle this, Professor?
I tend to think, boy, that's a big question. One of the ways is to either know a lot of people personally in the media, or only consume edited media that you pay for. So our news and media consumption now mostly takes place on the internet, and it's things that are shared on a social media feed or have been shared by people you know. And those things tend to increase our own prejudices. And the content creators are also incentivized by clicks. So we refer to this stuff as being clickbait. And all of those things give you a kind of dopamine hit. It's almost like getting a shot of cocaine or something in how it makes you feel, because it feeds your own confirmation bias. So one of the things that I do is I get a physical newspaper delivered to my house every day, and I read it. And that might not seem like such a big deal, but one of the things it does is it allows for the editor of the newspaper to put the news into perspective for me, so that I know this is a big deal. It's on the front page. This is less important. It's on the back page. In other words, that newspaper can be shamed. Another important aspect in both media and in your personal life is I always want to deal with people who can be shamed. And one of the reasons I canceled my subscription to the New York Times was not because they made so many mistakes in their reporting, because there are always going to be mistakes in reporting. But it's over the last few years, the New York Times has not fixed those mistakes and apologized for them. All I'm looking for is, and I'm sorry, and we were wrong. And then I can move on with my life and say, well, yeah, you're a biased newspaper, but I can still, there's still some objective truth that can be held onto. So I would say, if you don't want to get the Wall Street Journal, my favorite online news source is the Dispatch. Again, I have no affiliation with them, and the subscription is $10 a month. I'd say get a subscription to the Dispatch if you're going to read an online newspaper, or but you want to pay for your news, and you want to have an editor, because even if there is an editorial bias, that editor can be shamed. And that's something you can do sort of in your own personal life. It's too hard to say, I'm just going to keep scrolling, because even then, that hate-filled stuff leaves an imprint in you.
So, because I think, and if others are raising their hands to stop me, but
briefly, Darren.
Okay, because I think that if someone is turning towards these publications that you're talking about, there's probably less concern about them. It's those who are being led to believe that these are lying publications and that they're conspiring against, the will of the people and whatnot. And then so it comes back to, when does freedom of speech break that point of freedom?
Right. Well, let me flip it a little bit and talk about old leadership that would be condemned today. So one of the leaders of during the civil rights era, who is often criticized for not doing more, is President Eisenhower. Because you'd say, like, why wasn't he doing more? But one of the arguments that Eisenhower made throughout the civil rights era is, I don't have to convince people who already believe in civil rights to protect the rights of Black people. I have to convince people who don't believe in civil rights for Black people to protect the civil rights of Black people. So he was constantly reaching out to Southerners and making appeals that they would agree with. He was always linking the civil rights movement, for instance, to freedom of religion. And you sort of say, why was he doing this? And it was to appeal to religious people in order to say, you need to understand that your freedom of religion, your right to practice your religion, Southerners, you need to protect that and preserve that, because this is the same right as civil rights. And so he constantly making an effort to connect. This is something that the old boss at AEI used to always emphasize, which is you have to find some common ground, something you agree on, and then build upon it. You can't insult someone into agreeing with you. So you have to start, and that's why when I'm talking about politics with almost anyone, I don't use any of those labels unless I'm angry and short-tempered, which I am sometimes. But if I'm actually trying to get something done, I almost start with, well, what are we trying to accomplish here? And then, okay, now let's see what's the best way of achieving that. But that form of leadership, you get condemned. You have to be very strong in order to be that kind of leader today, because everybody who is quote unquote on your side is going to call you a sellout.
Yeah, in fact, that's the next question. Bill, do you mind asking it aloud?
Yeah. Happy to. I've really zeroed in on your comments, Stephen, about labels, and it's just so interesting to think about how much of our conversations are limited and shut off by the insertion of labels which limits the conversation. It shuts the conversation down. And your comment about politicians, what a huge opportunity they have to get around that, but they can't. It's like they can't help themselves. And if one individual tries to explain, his political opposition will shut it down with labels. So big government versus small government instead of a discussion about effective government. Pro-immigration, anti-immigration instead of a discussion around rational, reasonable immigration. It's everywhere.
Yes, and one of the things that got me thinking about this, and because of another thing a class I was teaching, was one of my students in another seminar asked about Franklin Roosevelt. And they asked, well, if he had the power to become a dictator, why didn't he? And I said, because those weren't his heroes. It's important to have the right heroes and draw the right lessons from your heroes. In other words, if your hero is someone who is an abusive bully, then that you're going to consider yourself a success when you are an abusive bully. But if you're from a very young age taught that George Washington is a good guy because he stepped away from power, then that's going to get burned into you, right? We don't celebrate George Washington because he owned slaves. There were a lot of slave owners in the year 1750. They're not all on our $1 bill, right? So that's not why he is celebrated. He's celebrated for this very specific and important thing that's necessary for representative government, and that is he stepped away from power. And we used to be taught, hey, learn this lesson about George Washington. And I'd say for the last 20 to 30 years, we've just been taught about George Washington. Don't listen to him. He was a slave owner. Well, you're going to miss out on a lot if you focus on that. And that's like, and I always try to compare it to, or to remind ourselves in all humility, we're all doing something that the people of the future are going to condemn. And we don't know if it's going to be eating meat or using an internal combustion engine, or we don't know what it's going to be. But when I first looked at this stat probably 20 years ago, the number of abolitionists in America in 1820 was about the same as the number of vegetarians in America when I first looked at it. So, if you want to know how rare it was to point out that slavery was bad, well, now there are a lot more vegetarians, but when I first looked at that stat, they were pretty similar. So, understand and have a little humility about how you're going to be treated in the future, and recognize that the reason we look up to these people from the past is not because of the things that they did when they were acting like everybody else from their era. We look up to them for the things that they did where they were well ahead of their times, or when they showed extraordinary character. And so having the right heroes is really important to ever having good leaders in a society. They have to look up to the right people for the right reasons.
Awesome. I need to interrupt you, Professor, but awesome question and answer. Sydney, I think you may have a quick question, and we need to have a quick response.
I do, but I'm going to take us back to media because that's my place, because I'm a public relations consultant. So I'm there. Funny, Stephen, that you mentioned the thing about George Washington as being an idea of good. He is good. And it just kind of goes to your point about, Americans accept the good things, and we want to hear the good things and not always the bad. But to the media, there's a whole dust up right now in our state legislature over a media literacy bill that would sort of require media literacy to be taught in schools around, bias and how to find what's true, what's not true, how to choose your media, and to figure out what's opinion versus fact-based. And I think that that's what happens. I'm so happy to see that you get an actual physical newspaper. But how do we combat that? How do we combat the, hey, this is an opinion piece and you're putting this up as fact on Facebook when it's just somebody's opinion?
And a brief answer, Professor.
Read whole books, but written by historians, not people who, look, when you pick up a book, look at where the person teaches and what their area of expertise is, and read the whole thing from cover to cover. That's the shortest answer I can give.
Right. And I totally agree with that. And to take that into the Facebook realm, I would also probably say you should look at where the people are getting their information or where it's being published and what the bias is of that.
Of course. I mean, when I see stuff, and I can't believe, the people who share stuff written by the Epic Times, and you're just like I'm trying to remember the names of all of the ones, but
Zero Hedge would be one, but yes.
All the QAnon stuff, and you're just like, and people don't have any idea. A lot of people, and here's the other thing, like you say to yourself, well, I'm against human trafficking, so this is a post that's against human trafficking, I'm just going to share it. And you say like, yeah, but that was actually written by a QAnon conspiracy theorist. And it's because here's the thing, a lot of the lying that takes place is when they take a truth out of context. So I remember about a year ago, there was a thing where everybody was sharing this thing about some human trafficking arrests, saying, Donald Trump did this and he's finally cracking down. And you looked at it and you're like, no, there's about the same number of human trafficking cases as there have always been. And yes, there were these arrests, but when you put all of those things into one shareable little meme thing, it gives you the impression that somehow that's rare. Now, I would say this, it should all be shocking to us all the time how much human trafficking there is all the time. And we should be happy that the FBI is fighting this all the time, just no matter who's president of the United States. But it's very easy to take a small bit of information and then say something false about it.
Cool. Last big question before we do a quick lightning round, if there are any quick ones. But Cheryl, you have a question that's on the top of everyone's mind, which is so confusing to me. So I'm glad you asked it. Do you want to ask it? There you go.
I will. I almost felt like it was too basic for this group because I feel, you guys were talking about stuff that I'm catching up to. But selfishly, my family is in the middle of constant divide and stress and Facebook drama. And I have some black and white thinkers on both extremes. And, trying to understand, and better yet, when you made the question that, as a good leader or a teacher, your questions, what are we both trying to accomplish? I don't know, how do you moderate and help me understand both sides of the extreme thinking? And just, my question is, how can you explain the identity politics involved on both sides of that debate about wearing masks?
Well, again, it's because people think that every part of who they are needs to be an expression of their own politics, and thus the wearing of a mask or not wearing of a mask fits into this framework where they think that either I'm wearing a mask in order to show that, and I find it equally obnoxious. Because I see people wearing masks while they're driving their cars and stuff, and you're just like, what are you doing? You know, or on the beach when there's not anyone within 100 yards of you. Like, you don't need to wear a mask on a beach when you're walking your dog. Like, you're just doing that to feel good about yourself. And the same goes for the person who walks into Walmart, you know, not wearing a mask, kind of looking around, trying to make eye contact with people because that person wants to start a fight. And I just think I'm not attracted to either personality. the virtue signaling that goes on either side of the masking wars, I find wildly unattractive. But to get back to your other point, I'd say that one of the things that has been most damaging is the idea that we're supposed to, that we learn in order to become advocates, which is one of the things that I really am opposed to. And it drives me nuts when historians break this rule, because it's the most important rule I have, which is I'm not going to tell you what I think until after I do the research. And what and even Ms. Hart, you use the term black and white thinking. And one of the things I always say is like, I want to get away even from using the terms black and white, because that and because people will say, oh, well, it's not always black and white and it's usually shades of gray. But what if the answer is 12? Right? It's not black, it's not white, it's gray, it's 12, or it could be fish or something else. That, but when you approach information, and this is what drives me, Ms. Ayers, to get back to your question about bias. One of the ways in which we teach people to avoid bias leads to more bias, because one of the ways that I've seen in all of these proposed bills, I haven't looked at this one, so I don't know if this one does it, but it is all based on the pro and con essay where you show, quote unquote, both sides, the pros and the cons, and then you go and do research about the pro and the con. That's, to my thinking, the exact opposite way of approaching any question at all. If you ask me a question about history, where, you know, the big ones, like where does racism come from? And I were to say, is it from capitalism or is it from socialism? And then I'm going to go investigate the pros and the cons of that. Well, I've already framed my argument, haven't I? I'm going to go and find information that fits one of those narratives one way or the other. How about this? I'm going to go back and I'm going to say, okay, you, using your own words, tell me, where does this come from? Because the story might come out that it's neither. In our case, we were supposed to talk about capitalism today, but that's another one of the words that people use that is, you know, is so fraught with meaning. But I always find it interesting that, like, capitalism started out as an insult. It means you believe in this false idea that property exists. And now people who claim to be capitalists have adopted it. It's one of those things that I prefer. If you don't like the word capitalism, how about this one? Peace. Because what we're really talking about is people peacefully exchanging their labor and their goods and their services. But people don't think of capitalism as being synonymous with peace. Or how about the Democratic Party, which calling someone a Democrat was an insult? And they're like, no, that's what we actually believe in. We believe, and you know, shocking that they adopted the insult as the name of their party, right? But in each of these cases, a word used to be an insult became adopted by the proponents of the idea. Very strange, and probably also leads to, you know, bad effects down the line. So.
All right, forgive me for interrupting again, Professor. We are really out of time, but I do want to respect, if there's one like lightning round quick question, anyone that you just have to get off your chest? Darren, quickly.
So I would just say, so a lot of the politicians have been pointing out that they were telling lies or whatnot, or spreading lies. Is, aside from them not getting reelected by their constituents, should there be a speech monitor?
Probably not.
Got it. Quick answer, Professor.
No.
And Darren, a lot of our conversations, we're planning on doing this Fridays. We'll cover various aspects of this. So for example, next week, we're going to be talking about the history of the Republican Party. And that doesn't interest everyone, but it probably should, because the two sides of Democrats and Republicans, are they on the same side of the same coin, or are they complete opposites? To understand where we've been, so we can better know where we're going, no matter what your political party is or lack thereof. I hope you're finding value in these. They're all going to be posted online. The recording will be posted within an hour or two. And feel free to ask Professor Tootle. I ask you to follow him on Facebook. He had some really interesting comments, both professional and personal. And I'd like to ask my one question. If there is on a personal note, Professor, if there's one modern group that we should all be aware of, some neat trend, some cool sound, a great vibe, it doesn't matter what genre it is, what would you want us to know of that we're probly not
Are you
exposed to
talking about
already?
music or oh my gosh.
Yep, one group, yes.
I sort of already.
Just one.
The hardest question yet.
Well, I always say the Jayhawks, but I
He
said
knows
the
a lot.
Jayhawks in an earlier episode, didn't I? So I have to say someone else. You know what? I'm going to throw
Yep.
out somebody else who is just an underappreciated artist. And she goes by the name of Mira, Mirah. And depending on what you hear of hers first, you might love her or hate her because she's done so many things in different genres of music. But I promise you that no matter who you are or what kind of music you like, there's probably something that she's recorded that you would like, because it runs the gamut from like new wave to big band. She is just an incredible talent, and almost so talented that she can't contain it to one genre.
Love it. How many people have heard of Mira before? Is anyone? You're such a great educator,
I
Professor.
picked somebody obscure. Yeah.
Thank you. So team, that concludes today's discussion on the meaning of words and whether it's important. Hope you'll join us in the future, whether it's for the Republican Party next week or another topic in the future. Thanks for being a participant in good citizenry. Have a great day.